So a friend and mentor of mine told me a joke a few years ago when we were talking about this topic that we're going to be talking about this morning. And he told me he warned before telling the joke that it's a bad joke, it's a very corny joke, but I can't think about our topic anymore without thinking about this joke. It's just one of those that has stuck with me. So I'm telling you all of this because I'm warning you and apologizing to you because this is corny, but I'm going to start off with this because I can't get it out of my head. I want you all to suffer with it as well. So, this young man joined a monastery and was a new monk, and the head monk comes to him and gives him his first task. And his first task was to start making copies of their sacred text by hand copying the sacred text. And the young man sees a problem right away with it, though, because what the head monk is asking him to do is make copies of copies, not the original. And the young man asks the head monk, what if we've made a mistake along the way somewhere? What happens? We're just copying mistake after mistake after mistake instead of going back to the original. And the head monk realizes, this young guy's making a pretty good point. So he tells the young man, well, I'll go into our vaults and find the original and do some research and make sure that we haven't made any mistakes along the way. And this head monk is gone for hours and hours, and the young man finally walks down into the vault to find out what's going on, and he finds the old monk just sobbing, uncontrollably sobbing. The young man walks over to him and says, what's wrong? And the head monk goes, we missed the R, the word celebrate. Oh, come on. I told you it was corny. We're talking about celebrating. We're talking about looking for ways to celebrate this morning. And as we started, I had not looked at the song list for this morning. And we get to Our God Reigns. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of Him who brings good news announcing peace, proclaiming happiness. That fits perfectly with what we're talking about as well. Because we're looking for ways to celebrate even in the bad times. We're looking for good news. So as we're talking about this morning, I want you to turn to a couple of different places. Luke 2 will be in a very short amount of time. But we'll also be looking at Genesis 39, verse 20, through Genesis 41, verse 1. Now, we're not going to read that whole thing, but that's the part of the Genesis story that we're going to be looking at this morning. And none of that will be on the screen, so I want you to have that in ready as well. I'll give you a couple of minutes to get there. We'll be looking at Luke 2, verse 10 first. But celebration, it's something that we all love to do, isn't it? We look for things to celebrate, whether it be a birthday, anniversaries, graduations, baptisms, your team winning a big game. Unfortunately, that's not me this morning. Tennessee got killed last night. But countless other things. We look at things to celebrate. But what do we celebrate when things don't go well? Or do we celebrate anything when things don't go well? What do we celebrate when someone gets thrown into prison for no good reason? What do we do, or what do we celebrate if we get diagnosed with a disease that will more than likely end our lives way sooner than we thought it was going to? What do we celebrate in those times? You're probably familiar with Luke 10. It's part of the Christmas story. We read it every year. But here we are in September. We're going to look at it to begin with. It's definitely part of the story of the Christmas story, but it has so much to teach us about celebration in general. Luke 2:10, it says, but the angel said to them, do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. I'm going to give you my challenge right up front this morning. Like I said a few weeks ago, normally I wait till the end for that, but it's so important. I want us to see it right from the beginning. Our challenge for us this morning is that we need to become a faith family that can celebrate the good news for all people at all times. Celebrate the good news for all people at all times. It's easy to celebrate when things are going well, but it's not that easy sometimes when it's not. How or what do we celebrate when things aren't going well? And that's what we're going to look at this morning, is what are the things that we can hold on to even when life is not going the way we thought it should. That's where Luke 2:10 comes in. Let's break that passage down briefly. It says the first thing that the angel said right away was, "Do not be afraid." I would be afraid if a group of angels, or if one angel showed up. That would scare me. But it says, "Do not be afraid." Why? Why should we not be afraid there? Because the angel was bringing good news for all people for all time. Now, what was that good news? The good news was the birth of Jesus. And we'll get to more of that here in a minute. But you might be thinking that's great, but what does it mean for me? That means everything for us, doesn't it? Without the birth of Jesus, without Jesus coming to earth, we don't have a chance. That is the ultimate good news. The words good news is what we translate the word gospel from. The gospel is the good news of God. This promise of the shepherds of good news coming was not just for the shepherds, and that's the great thing about it. It was a promise for us that good news had come into the world. Good news had come into a lost world. The gospel of Jesus Christ that we have right here literally means good news. And we celebrate good news. The promise of the shepherds of good news of great joy for all the people was not just for those shepherds. It's for all of us. Jesus coming to earth as a baby to ultimately become the perfect payment for our sin should be a joy for all people. We have to look for the good in all situations. And that's where our theme verse for this whole series comes in. Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Now that's all well and good, but how do we put it into practical use? That's part of the issue. So let's put it to the test, so to speak. Let's apply all of this to our Joseph story that we've been looking at. Last week we left our Joseph story kind of on a cliffhanger. Potiphar's wife had accused Joseph of coming on to her instead of the other way around. And Potiphar, the last verse that we read, it said Potiphar burned with anger. And we stopped before going on in the story. Genesis 39:20 is where we're going to pick up in the Joseph story. Genesis 39:20 tells us what happened to Joseph. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. So Potiphar throws Joseph in prison for something he didn't even do. And this isn't even a normal prison. This was the king's prison. This was where anybody that was an enemy of the king was thrown, which means it was probably a pretty bad prison. If you do something against the king, you're probably going to get the worst of the worst. So what is there in that to celebrate? Chapter 40 starts out with the words, "sometime later." And I'll go ahead and give you the ending of chapter 40 as well. Chapter 40 begins with Joseph in prison. We don't know how long he had been there at that point. Chapter 40 ends with Joseph still in prison. So where's the good news in that? Things don't get better for Joseph quickly, and we mentioned that last week. Throughout this whole story of Joseph, they don't get better quickly. We know that Joseph had spent a good amount of time in jail so far, but again, we're not sure even at this point how long he was in prison, but we know all the way through chapter 40, he's still in prison. Yet God has been with Joseph again and again and again. He blessed him in Potiphar's house. Now he's blessing him in prison, so much so that he is the favorite in the eyes of the warden, and the warden has given him control of the other prisoners. He has been blessed even though he is not where he wants to be or where he thinks he needs to be. And in chapter 40, while he's in charge of everything, the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh end up thrown in prison. Now, these are very high, important people in the court of Pharaoh. The cupbearer is making the drink and testing the food of Pharaoh. The baker is the only one that can make food for Pharaoh. We don't know exactly why they're thrown in prison, but they were charged with making sure that Pharaoh was not poisoned. So think about it this way. Could it have been that a plot to assassinate Pharaoh had been uncovered and Pharaoh just wasn't sure yet who the culprit was? But we find these two men in prison. The warden puts them in the capable hands of Joseph. And in taking care of these two prisoners, Joseph starts to notice one morning that they both look really troubled. And he understands, he asks them why they're so down. And they explain that they had both had dreams the night before, but they didn't know the meaning of the dreams. And that's where we're going to pick up. We're going to pick up with Genesis 49 through 19, which is the cupbearer and the baker telling their dreams to Joseph. It says, so the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. And when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. And this is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. I'm guessing the baker probably wished he hadn't asked Joseph about his dream. Joseph gives these 2 very different interpretations, doesn't he? He tells the cupbearer he's going to be restored to his place. He tells the baker you're going to be dead. And the story goes on to tell us that the cupbearer was restored to his job and that Pharaoh ultimately hanged the baker. So as we've seen all through the story of Joseph up to this point, things still just don't go the way that he thinks that they're going to go. The cupbearer is so happy to be out of prison that he forgets to tell Pharaoh about Joseph. I could imagine it's a long time before he remembers him. That's the other part of it. We have the whole story told to us in just a few short chapters, so we read through it quickly. But let's take a look at Genesis 41, verse 1. It says, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. In our human nature, we jump to the Pharaoh had a dream part. We gloss over the first part of it. But Joseph had spent another 2 full years in prison for something that he didn't do. I can see him laying in his bunk, if he even had a bunk, or laying on the floor wherever he had to lay down. That night, the first night after the cupbearer was released, he probably didn't sleep at all, did he? He was probably so excited thinking he was going to get out of jail the next day. Nothing happened. Okay, well, maybe he just got busy. He'll surely come get me tomorrow. And then another day passed, and then another day. 2 full years, and he still finds himself in prison. My guess is he probably had lost just about all hope of ever getting out at that point. So where's the good news for Joseph? If we're supposed to be finding and celebrating the good news, where is the good news for Joseph in this? How did he keep from becoming a bitter old man, waiting to die in a dungeon in a foreign land, not of his own making? I'm convinced that Joseph knew without a shadow of a doubt that God was with him. It's like Max Lucado says in the book, You'll Get Through This. He had in mind God telling him basically the same thing, you'll get through this. It won't be painless, it won't be quick, but God will use this mess for good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive, but don't despair either. With God's help, you will get through this. I think he had that thought in his mind. And at the end of Joseph's story, we find his own words that convinces me again and again, beyond any doubt, that he knew that God was with him. We've looked at this verse before, but in talking with his brothers, he states in Genesis 50:20, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph realized that God was in control of all of it. Joseph lived his life under the New Testament banner that has been our theme verse for this series, Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who have been called according to His purpose. He lived that out. But my question to you this morning is, do you believe that? Do you believe that? Do you believe that there is good news for all people at all times? Even when you spent 2 years trapped in a prison you did nothing to deserve. Well, if you're not convinced, I have a couple of stories I want to tell you of people that I personally know that have become messengers of good news even when they serve in their own types of prisons over things that they couldn't control or some things that they did control. The first is a man named Josh Wandell, and he is literally in a prison without bars. I first met Josh about 5 years ago. And at that point, Josh was a 36-year-old elementary school principal back in Tennessee. And as of right now, he's still with us, but he is around 5 years into his battle with ALS. And if you know anything about ALS, it is a nasty, nasty disease. Josh is now confined to a wheelchair. He still actually goes on runs. People have bought him a running wheelchair and push him on 5Ks and 10Ks, and I think he's even done a couple of marathons now. But let me tell you this man, the first time I ever met him, he did an interview at my home church with one of our ministers. And that's what he does now, even to this day, even confined to a wheelchair. He goes around to other churches spreading the good news of Jesus and what Jesus can do even when he's trapped in his own prison. Josh didn't want this disease to take his life from him without giving glory to God through it. And he is doing that, and doing that very well. His motto, or his phrase that he has turned into this theme, he's using these giant platforms that he's been given, is faith over fear. Think about that. When we can put our faith in God, we don't have a whole lot to fear, do we? But he is not only going to churches, he's getting interviews online, on news channels. He is spreading the message of Jesus confined to a wheelchair, confined to his own body. He can pretty much do nothing for himself at this point. When I first met him, he knew that was his fate. But you couldn't see it in his face. He knew that he served a bigger purpose than what this disease was going to take from him. So he was asked in that interview, where's the good news in his diagnosis? And he says, the good news is simply that this disease is giving me a platform to talk about Jesus in places that I would have never had the opportunity to do if it wasn't for this disease. That's finding the good news in a bad situation. The other story I want to tell you is a friend of mine named Matt Reiber. I think I'm pronouncing his last name right, but Matt grew up with a rough life. And early in his adult life, he found himself in prison. Of his own doing, he was rightfully in prison. He was into drugs and alcohol and got busted. And through that, he went into a rehab facility. And in that rehab facility, it was a Christian rehab facility, and he was presented with the gospel. And he accepted it. He wasn't baptized at that time, but he accepted it, did all the steps that he was supposed to do, thought he was going to get out and just move on with his life. But he fell back into bad habits. And he was working as a bartender in Dallas. And he was drinking just as much as he was serving to other people. And fell back into the wrong crowd with drugs and alcohol addiction. And he got arrested again. And this was supposed to be basically his third strike. He was going to prison for a long, long time. And the first night, he was in a county lockup, and he wasn't in individual rooms. It was kind of a bunk jail cell. And he had already decided that he was going to take what he thought was the best way out. He had broken his razor into pieces and was ready to go into the bathroom after lights out and slit his wrist and just be done. And right before lights out, or right as lights out, as he was getting up, the guy on his top bunk came down and said, "Hey, do you know anything about this book?" And he held up a Bible. And Matt tells me when he saw that, he had already decided to end it all, but he was like, "Hey, yeah, I know this," because he'd gone through that Christian rehab. He wasn't living it, but he knew the Bible. And that one question, he stayed up all night talking with his bunkmate, and that turned into a Bible study. And that turned into multiple people in that prison, including Matt, becoming baptized as a full believer in Jesus Christ. And I tell you that story because Matt Reiber is the youth minister at the Christian church in Watonga right now. He had given up all hope until somebody reminded him what the good news of the Bible was. There is good news in every situation. If we hold on to Jesus, that's the good news. So, where's the good news in your story? That's what I want you to think about as you go home this afternoon. Where's the good news in your story? There's a lot of people in this room and in this congregation in general that are dealing with very, very heavy, bad things in their lives. Find that good news and celebrate it at all times. It's through Jesus that we're able to do that. And if you don't have a personal relationship with Him, if you've not taken that step that Matt did and gotten baptized, so I ask every Sunday, why not today? Any decision you need to make, now's the time to do so as we stand and sing, "The Savior is Waiting," number 483.